It was a peaceful afternoon at a crowded public market. Warm sunlight spilled across the stone walkways, and the air carried the smell of fresh bread, roasted coffee, and sweet fruit from the nearby stalls. Street musicians sat near the entrance playing soft guitar melodies, while families wandered through the market, laughing and enjoying the slow rhythm of the day. Nothing about the scene felt unusual. Children chased pigeons between the tables. Vendors called out friendly offers to passing customers. Couples sat together under large umbrellas, sipping coffee and talking quietly. It was the kind of place where people came to relax, where strangers smiled at each other, where nothing ever seemed to go wrong. Near the edge of the market, at a small outdoor cafe table, sat an older man. He wore simple clothes, a dark jacket, jeans, and worn boots. Nothing about his appearance suggested fame, power, or danger. To most people passing by, he looked like just another quiet visitor enjoying a peaceful moment in the sun. In front of him was a small cup of coffee. Steam slowly curled upward into the air as he watched the crowd move through the marketplace. His posture was relaxed, his breathing steady, every movement calm and controlled. He didn't speak to anyone. He didn't try to attract attention. And for the most part, people barely noticed him. But if someone had looked a little closer, they might have seen something different. There was a strange stillness about him, a quiet confidence that didn't need to prove anything. The kind of calm you usually only see in people who have already faced chaos before. People who have nothing left to fear. For several minutes, everything remained perfectly normal. The music played. The market buzzed. Life moved forward like it always did. But not far away, someone else had just entered the market. A tall man with broad shoulders pushed through the crowd, with the kind of arrogance that demanded attention. His heavy footsteps echoed against the stone pavement as he moved between people without apology. Where the older man carried calm, this man carried tension. Where the older man brought silency, this man brought trouble. And in just a few moments their paths were going to cross. No one in the market knew it yet. Not the vendors, not the musicians, not the families enjoying their afternoon. But the peaceful afternoon was about to change. Because one arrogant man was about to make the biggest mistake of his life. He was about to pick a fight with Steven Seagal. The peaceful rhythm of the market continued. Music played softly near the entrance while people moved between the stalls, enjoying the calm afternoon. Vendors handed customers bags of fresh fruit, and children laughed as they ran through the open walkway. At the small cafe table near the edge of the market, Steven Seagal still sat quietly with his coffee. He hadn't moved much. His attention drifted slowly across the crowd, observing the small details most people ignored. A street artist sketching portraits, a woman bargaining for flowers, a man feeding crumbs to birds near the fountain. Everything felt ordinary, peaceful, but that peace was about to crack. From the far side of the market, a tall, muscular man forced his way through the crowd. He was impossible not to notice. Broad shoulders, thick arms, a heavy gym bag slung across his back. His confident stride carried the unmistakable attitude of someone used to dominating every room he entered. People stepped aside as he pushed forward, barely acknowledging the irritated looks he left behind. He didn't apologize when he bumped into someone. He didn't slow down. In fact, he seemed to enjoy the attention. A few people whispered as he passed. "Isn't that the boxing coach from the gym down the street?" "I think so." He carried himself like a man who had spent his life proving his strength to others, and today he looked ready to prove it again. As he pushed through the narrow cafe area, his shoulder suddenly slammed into a chair. "Sielka." The chair scraped loudly across the stone floor. The coffee cup tipped over. Dark liquid spilled across the small table. For a brief moment, everything froze. The older man calmly stood up. It was Steven Seagal. He looked down at the spilled coffee, then at the man standing in front of him. There was no anger in his eyes, no tension, just quiet patience. "I'm sorry about that," he said calmly. The boxing coach stared at him. His expression hardened instantly. "You're sorry," he scoffed. His voice was loud enough that nearby conversations began to slow. "You should watch where you're going, old man." A few people nearby turned their heads. The insult hung in the air, but Steven didn't react. He simply nodded slightly. "My mistake. That should have been the end of it. One apology, one step away, a normal misunderstanding between two strangers." But the coach wasn't looking for peace. Something about the calmness irritated him. Maybe it was the way Steven didn't look intimidated. Maybe it was the quiet confidence in his posture. Or maybe he simply needed an audience. Whatever the reason, he stepped closer. "You think saying sorry fixes everything?" he said, his voice rising. More people turned to watch now. Phones slowly appeared in hands, not openly filming yet, just waiting. Steven remained completely relaxed, his shoulders loose, his breathing steady. "I didn't mean to bump into you," he said again. But the coach shook his head with a mocking laugh. "You people always say that." The tension thickened. Some in the crowd expected the older man to leave. Others expected him to argue back. But Steven did neither. He simply stood there calm and silent. And somehow, that silence made the coach even angrier. "Before we continue, tell me something in the comments. Where are you watching from right now? And more importantly, have you ever seen someone stay completely calm, even while being disrespected in public?" Because what was about to happen next was something this arrogant coach would never forget. The air in the market slowly began to change. Only a few moments earlier, people had been laughing, shopping, and enjoying the quiet afternoon. But now, conversations faded into whispers as more and more eyes turned toward the growing tension near the cafe tables. In the center of it all stood Steven Seagal, calm, quiet, and completely still. Across from him stood the boxing coach, tall, muscular, and growing more irritated by the second. The coach took another step forward, invading Steven's space as if trying to force a reaction out of him. "You think you're tough standing there like that?" he said loudly. A few people nearby exchanged uncomfortable glances. Some shoppers quietly moved their children further away. Others stayed exactly where they were, sensing that something unusual was about to happen. Steven didn't move. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't even change his expression. He simply looked at the man in front of him with the same calm eyes. "I already apologized," Steven said quietly. The coach laughed loudly, shaking his head as if the situation amused him. "That's the problem with guys like you," he said. "You think being polite makes you strong." A few people in the crowd frowned at the comment. The insult wasn't just unnecessary, it was cruel. But the coach seemed to enjoy the growing attention. More phones appeared now. Some people began recording. The coach noticed the cameras and straightened his shoulders, clearly enjoying the audience. "Look at you," he continued, circling slightly around Steven like a predator testing its prey. "You probably never stepped inside a real gym in your life." Steven said nothing. His silence only made the moment heavier. The coach leaned closer, lowering his voice slightly. "You know what I see," he said. "I see a weak old man pretending to be calm." A woman standing nearby shook her head quietly. Another man whispered to his friend, "This guy needs to relax." But the coach wasn't listening to anyone. He was too focused on proving his dominance. "You should be thanking me," the coach continued. "I'm giving you a free lesson in how the real world works." Steven finally spoke again. His voice remained steady. "There's no reason for this to go further." For a moment, it sounded almost like advice, like a final chance to walk away. But the coach misread it completely. Instead of calming down, his expression hardened even more. "Oh, there's definitely a reason," he said. He jabbed a finger toward Steven's chest. "You disrespected me." A quiet murmur spread through the crowd. Everyone knew that wasn't true. The bump had been accidental. The apology had been sincere. But some people don't look for truth. They look for excuses. The coach straightened up again, speaking loudly enough for everyone around to hear. "You know what your problem is," he said. "You think staying quiet makes you look wise." He leaned closer, almost nose to nose with Steven. "But all it really does is make you look weak." The crowd waited. Tension stretched through the air like a wire about to snap. Some people expected Steven to finally lose his patience. Others thought he might just walk away. But instead, he simply stood there, still calm, still silent, still completely in control. And that calmness was the one thing the coach couldn't understand. Because in his world, strength was loud, strength was aggressive, strength needed to prove itself. But the quiet confidence standing in front of him didn't follow those rules. And that difference made him furious. The coach suddenly threw his gym bag onto the ground. The loud thud echoed across the stone pavement. Now everyone was watching. Even the street musicians had stopped playing. The coach cracked his neck slowly. "You know what?" he said. "Let's see if you're still calm after this." A few people gasped softly. The tension had finally reached its breaking point. Because in the next moment, the coach was about to cross a line he could never uncross. And once he did, the peaceful afternoon in that market would never feel the same again. For a moment, everything stood still. The market that had been filled with laughter only minutes ago now felt tense and quiet. People stood frozen in place, watching the confrontation unfold near the cafe tables. In the center of it all stood Steven Seagal, calm, silent, completely unmoved. Across from him, the boxing coach rolled his shoulders and flexed his hands like a man preparing to prove something. His jaw tightened. His eyes burned with irritation. And the more Steven refused to react, the more the coach seemed to lose control of his temper. "You're really going to stand there like that?" The coach snapped, Steven's expression remained calm. "I don't want trouble," he said quietly. The words weren't aggressive. They weren't fearful either. They sounded like simple truth. But to the coach, they felt like a challenge. Because people who thrive on intimidation often expect fear, and when they don't get it, they push harder. The coach stepped even closer now. Close enough that the space between them disappeared. The crowd around them tightened into a silent circle. Some people whispered nervously. Others lifted their phones a little higher. No one wanted to interfere. But no one wanted to miss what was happening either. A woman near the fruit stand covered her mouth with her hand. "This isn't going to end well," she murmured. The coach tilted his head slightly, studying Steven's calm face. "You think you're better than me," he said. Steven didn't answer. His breathing remained slow and steady. The coach laughed harshly. "That's what I thought." Then suddenly, he raised his hand. For a split second, the motion was so quick that some people didn't even understand what was happening. But the next sound made it painfully clear. "Smak." The sharp crack of the slap echoed across the entire market. The sound bounced off the stone buildings and cut through the air like a gunshot. Gasps erupted from the crowd. A few people instinctively stepped backward. Even the pigeons scattered from the nearby fountain. For a moment, there was absolute silence. No music, no voices, no movement. The coach lowered his hand slowly, breathing heavily. His chest rose and fell as if he had just won a fight. But the man he had slapped hadn't moved. And Steven's head had turned slightly from the impact. But instead of reacting with anger, he slowly turned his face back toward the coach. His expression remained calm. There was no rage in his eyes. No panic. Only a quiet disappointment. The kind of look a teacher gives a student who has just made a very serious mistake. The coach frowned. He had expected shouting. Maybe even a desperate attempt to fight back. But he hadn't expected this. He shifted his weight, suddenly unsure. "You see," he said loudly, trying to regain control of the moment. "Nothing." He turned toward the crowd as if presenting proof of his dominance. "Guy doesn't even know how to defend himself." Some people in the audience looked uncomfortable. Others whispered quietly. Because something about the situation didn't feel right, Steven still hadn't reacted. Not with anger. Not with fear. He simply stood there. Still calm, still steady. Slowly he lifted his hand and brushed a small line of dust from his jacket sleeve. The simple movement felt strangely deliberate, almost thoughtful. Then he looked back at the coach. "You shouldn't have done that," Steven said quietly. The coach laughed loudly. "Oh yeah." He spread his arms slightly, mocking the warning. "And what are you going to do about it?" Steven studied him for a moment, not with anger, but with patience. Like someone who understood exactly how the next few seconds would unfold. "I tried to stop this earlier," Steven said. His voice remained soft, but every word carried weight. "I gave you more than one chance." The coach shook his head, still smiling arrogantly. "Save the speeches, old man." He took another aggressive step forward. "You're standing in front of a boxing coach." Steven didn't respond immediately. Instead, he exhaled slowly, the kind of calm breath someone takes before making an important decision. The crowd waited. Every eye remained fixed on the two men. Because even though the coach believed he had already won, something about Steven's quiet composure suggested the moment wasn't over yet. Not even close, and in just a few seconds, everyone watching would understand exactly why. Because the man the coach had just slapped wasn't an ordinary old man. For several long seconds, no one moved. The market that had once been full of laughter and music now felt strangely frozen, like the entire place was holding its breath. At the center of the silent circle stood Steven Seagal. Calm. Still, unshaken. The red mark from the slap was faintly visible on his cheek, but his expression hadn't changed. Across from him, the boxing coach stood with his arms slightly raised, chest puffed out as if waiting for applause. But the crowd wasn't cheering, they were watching. Studying the strange calmness of the man he had just hit. The coach shifted his weight impatiently. "Well," he said loudly, "you gonna do something, or are you just gonna stand there?" Steven looked at him quietly. His eyes were steady, thoughtful. "You already did enough," he said calmly. The coach scoffed. "Oh, please." He waved a dismissive hand. "You talk like some kind of wise monk." He took another step closer, his boots scraping lightly against the stone pavement. But the real world doesn't work like that. Steven remained silent. The coach leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "Out here, strength is what matters." He tapped his own chest proudly. "And I've spent my whole life proving mine." Steven studied him for a moment, almost as if he were trying to understand something deeper. Then he spoke again. "Strength without control isn't strength," he said quietly. "It's just anger." A small murmur moved through the crowd. Several people exchanged glances. The words landed heavier than expected, but the coach only laughed. "Spare me the philosophy." He rolled his shoulders, stretching his neck. "You think a couple of fancy words scare me?" Steven slowly shook his head. "I'm not trying to scare you." The coach raised an eyebrow. "Oh, really?" Steven's voice remained calm. "I'm trying to warn you?" That made the coach laugh even louder. "Warn me." He spread his arms wide. "Look around." He gestured toward the crowd. "Everyone here just watched me slap you, and you didn't do a thing." Some people in the audience shifted uncomfortably, because something about that statement didn't feel true. Steven hadn't reacted, but it didn't look like weakness. It looked like restraint. The coach stepped closer again, his voice turning mocking. "You know what I think?" Steven didn't answer. "I think you're scared." The crowd watched carefully, waiting. The coach leaned closer, lowering his voice so only the people closest could hear. "You're lucky I'm in a good mood today." Steven sighed softly. The sound wasn't frustration. It sounded more like disappointment. "I was hoping you'd stop," he said. The coach frowned. "Stop what?" Steven's eyes remained calm. "Before you embarrass yourself further." A few people in the crowd gasped quietly. The coach's smile disappeared instantly. "What did you say?" Steven didn't repeat himself. Instead, he slowly adjusted the sleeve of his jacket. The small movement felt strangely deliberate, like a man preparing for something. The coach noticed it too. "Oh, now you're getting ready," he mocked. He cracked his knuckles loudly. Finally, Steven lifted his eyes toward him again. "There's still time to walk away." The coach shook his head slowly. "You don't get it, do you?" He took a fighting stance now, his feet planting firmly against the stone pavement. "This is what I do. I train fighters. I break people stronger than you every day." The tension in the crowd thickened again. Everyone could feel that the moment was approaching, but Steven still didn't raise his hands. He simply stood there, balanced, relaxed, like a man who had nothing to prove. That calmness confused the coach even more. "Why aren't you defending yourself?" he demanded. Steven's voice remained soft. "Because I'm hoping you make a better decision." The coach shook his head. "You're unbelievable." He rolled his neck again, preparing himself. "All right, if that's the way you want it." He raised his fists. The crowd leaned forward slightly. Phones lifted higher. Someone whispered nervously, "Something's about to happen." And they were right. Because the coach had already crossed every warning Steven had given him. And in just a few seconds, he was about to discover that the quiet man standing in front of him wasn't weak, wasn't afraid, and definitely wasn't ordinary. But by the time he realized that truth, it would already be too late. The tension in the market had reached its breaking point. No one spoke. No one moved. Dozens of people stood frozen around the small cafe area, their phones raised, their eyes locked on the two men standing only a few feet apart. In the center of the circle stood Steven Seagal, relaxed, balanced, completely calm. Across from him, the boxing coach bounced slightly on his feet, fists raised in a trained fighter's stance. His confidence had returned, fueled by the attention of the crowd. To him, this was simple. He had faced opponents in the gym every day. Stronger men, younger men, professional fighters, and now he believed he was about to prove something in front of everyone watching. "You should have walked away when you had the chance," the coach said. Steven didn't respond. He simply stood there, his hands resting naturally by his sides. The coach smirked. "Fine," he said. "You asked for this." Without warning, he lunged forward. His right fist shot through the air with speed and power, aimed directly at Steven's face. It was a clean punch, fast, explosive, the kind of strike that had probably knocked out plenty of opponents before. But it never landed. In one smooth motion, Steven shifted slightly to the side. The punch cut through empty air. Before the coach could even understand what had happened, Steven's hand gently touched his arm. It wasn't a strike. It wasn't violent. It was simply control. Steven redirected the momentum of the punch with almost effortless precision. The coach stumbled forward, his balance suddenly gone. Gasps burst from the crowd. What just happened? Someone whispered. The coach tried to recover instantly. Years of boxing training kicked in. He spun around and threw another punch, this one faster, more desperate. But once again, Steven moved calmly. Another small step, another precise redirection. The coach's second punch also missed completely. Now confusion began to replace confidence. The coach attacked again, this time with a combination. Left hook, right cross. Fast, aggressive, but every strike met the same result. Steven didn't fight the punches. He flowed around them. Each movement small, efficient, almost effortless. The crowd watched in stunned silence. To them, it looked almost unreal. A trained boxing coach was throwing full power punches, and somehow missing every single one. Steven finally stepped slightly closer. His hand gently caught the coach's wrist. Before the coach could react, Steven rotated his arms smoothly, not violently, just enough to break his balance. The coach's body turned with the motion. His feet slipped on the stone pavement, and within a second, he found himself face down on the ground. A collective gasp exploded from the crowd. No one had even seen the exact moment it happened. 1 second the coach was attacking. The next second he was pinned helplessly against the pavement. Steven stood above him calmly, holding the arm in a controlled lock. The position wasn't painful, but it made movement impossible. The coach struggled slightly. Nothing happened. His strength meant nothing in that position. "Relax," Steven said quietly. His voice carried no anger, no aggression, just calm authority. The coach froze. Because for the first time since the confrontation began, he realized something terrifying. The man controlling him wasn't even breathing hard. Steven slowly released the pressure and stepped back. The coach rolled onto his side and pushed himself up, his face red with embarrassment. Murmurs spread through the crowd. Then someone near the back suddenly spoke. "Wait, hold on." The voice sounded surprised. "Is that?" Another person leaned forward, squinting. "No way." Then someone else said it out loud. "That's Steven Seagal." The words spread through the crowd like electricity. More whispers followed. "It is. I knew he looked familiar. Isn't he a martial arts master?" The coach's face slowly drained of color. He turned his head toward the quiet man standing calmly a few steps away. The same man he had just insulted. The same man he had slapped. Now the realization hit him all at once. He hadn't challenged an ordinary older man. He had attacked someone who had spent a lifetime mastering control. And suddenly, the entire situation felt very different. The coach lowered his eyes slightly. For the first time since the confrontation began, his confidence was gone, and in its place was regret. For several seconds after the realization spread through the crowd, no one spoke. The market, which had turned into a stage for confrontation just moments earlier, now felt strangely quiet again. People slowly lowered their phones. Whispers passed between strangers, and in the center of it all stood Steven Seagal, calm as ever. The boxing coach remained still where he stood. His breathing was heavier now, but not from the short exchange of movements. It was something else. Embarrassment. Regret. A few minutes earlier, he had been loud, confident, even arrogant. Surrounded by an audience, he believed he was about to prove his strength. But now the same crowd was looking at him very differently, and he could feel it. The coach rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly, avoiding eye contact with the people around him. Finally, he looked back at Steven. The anger that had fueled his behavior earlier was gone. In its place was something quieter, something more honest. "I didn't know who you were," he muttered. Steven's expression didn't change. His voice remained calm. "That's not the point." The coach looked confused for a moment. Steven stepped a little closer, but there was no threat in his posture. "Respect shouldn't depend on recognition," he continued. "It shouldn't matter whether someone is famous, powerful, or completely unknown." The coach lowered his gaze slightly, because he understood exactly what Steven meant. A few people in the crowd nodded quietly. Steven glanced briefly around at the onlookers. Dozens of strangers had gathered during the confrontation, each witnessing the moment unfold. But instead of anger or humiliation, Steven simply sighed softly. "You're strong," he said to the coach. "That much is obvious." The coach looked up slightly, surprised by the words. "But strength alone isn't enough," Steven continued. "Without discipline, strength becomes dangerous." The coach didn't argue. For the first time since the confrontation began, he simply listened. Steven gestured lightly toward the gym bag still lying on the pavement nearby. "You train fighters," he said. "That means people look to you as an example." The coach swallowed hard. The weight of those words hit him harder than any physical technique. Because he knew it was true. People trusted him. Students followed his guidance. And moments earlier, he had acted like a bully in front of an entire crowd. Steven took one final step back. The tension that had filled the market earlier was now completely gone. People began returning slowly to their conversations. Vendors resumed selling their goods. The musicians near the entrance picked up their instruments again. Life began to move forward once more. But before leaving, Steven looked back at the coach one last time. "You still have time to become the kind of man your students deserve," he said calmly. The coach nodded slowly. He didn't try to defend himself. He didn't try to argue. Instead, he simply said two quiet words. "I'm sorry." Steven gave a small nod, not dramatic, not theatrical, just simple acknowledgement. Then he turned and began walking away through the market. People stepped aside respectfully as he passed. Some nodded. Others smiled quietly. But Steven didn't look for attention. He simply walked away the same way he had arrived. Calm, silent, unassuming. Within minutes, the market returned to its normal rhythm. The confrontation was over. But the lesson remained. Because sometimes the strongest people in the world aren't the loudest. They're the ones who stay calm when everyone else loses control. The ones who choose restraint when others choose anger. And the ones who understand that true respect should never depend on fear. It should simply be given. Because we are all human. If you believe respect should be given to everyone, no matter who they are, comment respect below, and the next move was going to change everything.